loads of work needs to be done to keep the railway running. And do I think that the railways would be in any condition for these trains to travel on? Partly yes, and some of the reason is this. Hello, I'm Howard. I've worked in UK railway engineering for nearly 20 years in everything from maintenance, renewals, and fault response to project work, design work, and management. I wanted to have a look at this game today. There was a lot of requests for this on the channel. It's Metro Exodus, which is a fantastic game. But just to make things clear, I'm not a lore expert in Metro. I know it's a big series of games and a book, and there's a lot of lore and depth to it. I'm not the expert on that. I've only played this one game, Metro Exodus. So I'm mainly going to be looking at things from an engineering standpoint and sort of what they got right, what they could have done better, some good and bad points, and some of the aspects of engineering that go into railways and perhaps making this game. See, could it have run? Is this something that could have operated? And what are the effects exactly of the nuclear apocalypse on the railway? We shall see. Now, the first thing any other Europeans or Americans or 60% of the world's countries, in fact, might notice is that the gauge seems very wide. The gauge being the distance between the two inside running edges of the rail. And you can see this is quite a wide gauge. Now, this is possibly correct because the Russians use a wider gauge than the rest of Europe and Britain. They use a 5-foot gauge, whereas we use what's called a 4-foot gauge. There are advantages and disadvantages to different types of gauge. Your narrower gauge is much cheaper to build. You don't have to build the tunnels as wide. There's simply less mass, and you pay for mass. You pay for mass of wood and concrete and steel. And you have to make your curves of a larger radius to accommodate the width of a wider gauge. So that can incur cost, and it impinges on where you can build. But broader gauges, they can obviously have greater capacity and carry more stuff on the same railway. So in Russia, the gauge will appear wider to most people than they used to. So this gauge looking wide to me. I'm not sure of the exact measurement in-game, but it is a wider gauge. So that's partly possibly down to having to fit the size of the Aurora and its walkways and stuff on. And partly just that's how Russian railways are built. As for the rails themselves, they've gone for a flat bottom rail design, which is really the most sensible one for the time this game was invented. And you can see that this is held in place with base plates. You can see just hammer-in spike fastenings there, probably, and jointed together rather than being welded. This being a joint bar, you'd call it in the USA, or a fish plate joint in the UK. And you can see there's bolts facing opposing ways next to each other. That's very common in other areas of the world. It's not done in Britain. We tend to have the bolts facing the same way. But in the US and I think Russia, they have those opposing bolts. So that's a good bit of attention to detail. We might see some older bullhead design when it comes to Red Dead Redemption 2 or something of that age, late 1800s maybe. They've gone for flat bottom on base plates in this, which is looks a bit like this. The classic choice, used very commonly worldwide. So here we are, let's have a look at some switches and crossings, S and C, as I like to call it for short. So this is a standard crossover, turnout from line to line, usually called a crossover. Here's some points operating equipment. This is good to see. Don't get this often in games. This is usually omitted. Levers. Yeah, obviously, these levers would normally attach to the bits where the rails are broken there. Unfortunately, you can see the rails at the end have broken. So that where that break is, you'd normally see the equipment attaching there. So they've made a bit of effort here in planing down the rail, because you got have what you call the plane length on the switch blade here, the switch rail, where the side of it will be planed down and profiled to allow the train wheel to pass on the left side, and also where it meets the right rail to meet up on the right hand side. Now it's not 100% correct, but they have made some effort to plane that down and make it look like the end of a switch, which is good. You've got different rail profiles and cuts. You've got chamfered cuts, chamfered undercuts, and that's just the different ways in which the rail fits together at the toe of the switch. Obviously, it's missing the last little length there, but you get the idea. On this side, they've not made the head cut and chamfered it down. What the? I have been taken up by Jesus. That is definitely not Jesus. Oh, this game. So importantly in this game, they get something right here, which is the crossing nose. Not every game gets this right. This is what allows the wheels to pass so that rails don't just clip through each other like we've seen in some other games. That gap there, that allows the wheels to pass through that gap, either left or right. One thing I am noticing here with this crossover, the rails are unsupported in the crossover section. So normally what you'd have here is much longer timbers to accommodate the crossover section, which are just not present here. The rail's not bolted down. I think what's happened here is the developers just haven't been sure about the proper structure of a crossover and how to support those rails. Because obviously, a rail is very much more ductile than you think, and it's very bendy. And if a train went over that, those rails would just sink into the ground and snap, probably. So just a small oversight there. This is what it should look like. You see the concrete in this case supports. In this case, it would be wood, but the principle would be the same, to have those longer sections of timber or concrete to support the rails in the crossover. So I can joyfully report that for the first time in the 5 games I've reviewed so far, we have a stretcher bar and also working points operating equipment. A working lever operated points machine, which you can see here, and also this stretcher bar, which also acts as the drive bar for the system. This stretcher bar, the purpose of that, this bar between the two rails, is to allow the wheel of the train to pass either through the left or the right hand sides by maintaining the correct gap and allowing the points to move over in unison and leave the correct gap either side for the wheels to pass through. So we can look at this in operation. That's currently set going left. You can see this little mechanical signal with the arrow pointing left. There's another arrow pointing forward that will presumably move when we pull this lever. So the left-hand side of the switch is now open, and the right-hand side is closed. So when we pull this lever, the left-hand side of the switch closes, and the right hand opens. And so the points are set for straight on now, and this signal has changed accordingly, so that this side is now closed, or it would be if the gauge was properly maintained, but it's obviously old and knackered. And the right hand side of the switch will be open to allow the wheel to pass, which will send the train straight on. And it's good that the signal's changed in accordance with that. That's a working signal and a working set of points with a stretcher bar / drive bar. This is really good to see. And when we pull it again, the right hand side will close and the left hand side will open. There we go. And now it's set left and we pull it back to right, and the little signal flicks around to tell the driver which way the points are set to. And you can see here the connection rodding between the drive of the points machine and the stretcher bar, so that it shoves the points across in unison as both rails are joined by that bar in the middle, the stretcher bar. It's a mechanically sound piece of kit. Top marks for that. It's the first game I've reviewed where I've seen working points equipment, stretcher bars, and a working signal. Left to themselves, the condition of assets on the railway generally go from bad to worse, and that's why the railway needs constant maintenance. It's a high cost, a lot of work, high maintenance job. Loads of work needs to be done to keep the railway running. And do I think that the railways would be in any condition for these trains to travel on? Partly yes, and some of the reason is this. Now you can see that's what's described in the game as a patrol train, is how the characters describe it, which would imply that if there's trains out on patrol, then the infrastructure is being maintained enough to keep a patrol train running. So somewhere out there's post-apocalyptic teams of Russian railway engineers keeping the line going in order to have these patrol trains. They've put quite a lot of effort into that train. It's armoured, It's armed. Why would you go through that extent if it could only go 100 yards outside the depot? You wouldn't. So the only way that continues to run is if the tracks and all the assets are maintained at the points. Probably not the signals, because there's not enough running to warrant that. You don't have to worry about signalling trains if there's only one or two rolling around the country. There are some bits of the railway in the post-apocalypse that are obviously and completely knackered. However, when you're driving around Volga, which is this snowy area closest to civilization or what's left of it, where there's patrol trains, they've got enough technology left to have patrol trains. You can see that the infrastructures, despite the severe lack of ballast, which there's not much gross annual tonnage of trains on this, I suppose, but not very stable. But apart from the lack of ballast, things here seem generally okay. There's not broken rails everywhere. And what is quite impressive is the vegetation management, because it doesn't take very long at all for vegetation to get a bit out of hand on the railway, especially where the ballast has gone away and it's just mud and soil. Trees will just start growing out of it after not so long. But given there's patrol trains in the area, they've probably kept that clear. So there's vegetation management going on, perhaps, or it could be the severe snow and radiation, more likely, because you do see some light vegetation growing as you get further out towards the Caspian, towards the desert regions, where it's probably managed less. They probably don't send the trains out that far from Moscow. But even then, the infrastructure in this area doesn't look too bad. The, this is probably not where, this is more in the middle of nowhere, where a bomb probably didn't hit directly. This is more sort of where it might be affected but not completely destroyed. You can see there's still a lot of overhead line stanchions. There was a transformer station there. A lot of this is still standing. You've got a couple of main lines in a loop here with switches and crossings that make sense. All the turnouts are at an angle that's suitable for this sort of line and this sort of line speed. One of the things they've done well in this game is the overhead line system. A lot of it's broken, but these bits here are pretty intact. And you can see they've got all the right components. They've got the mast itself, and then you can see there's two wires running down the length of the railway between the two rails. The bottom wire being the contact wire, that's the wire that actually touches the pantograph of the train. And then the top wire is the catenary wire, and then you can see there's a wire between the top and bottom ones holding it. They're what are commonly called droppers, and that's basically just to hold the bottom wire up with the top one. And then on the right hand side, about halfway down the post, you can see running along the outside of the system, that's probably the feeder wire. And just a bit further back down the track here, you can see the transformer that's putting a feed out onto the feeder line going that way. I did just want to touch on one thing here. While this scene is incredible and dramatic, and I absolutely loved it, there's a few problems. See how the train busts in, hits the side, and then moves back. There was no switch and cross in there for it to be able to do that. It's just Tokyo drifted across two lines there somehow. I don't think that's feasible, but that's just part of the level design and the action sequence. But completely forgivable, because this scene was so cool when you're actually playing it. To have that train burst out of there, it was an excellent moment in gaming that. Now, the track here is in significantly worse condition than further back down the line. You can see you've got a lot of rail twist here and perhaps cyclic top. Do you see the repeated dips after dips after dips? That's a condition you can get. You can see it better from the side here, called cyclic top. And that can be very dangerous. It's a derailment hazard specifically for freight trains, where you get a dip and then the train bounces and creates another dip, and eventually you end up with a series. And what can happen with heavier trains with not as good suspension, so freight trains, is they can bounce along that, and eventually it forms a wavelength as the train's moving down the track, a wavelength of bogies, like a sine wave. And what can happen is the train wheels can become mismatched with the wave of the track, and the waves become mismatched and the wheels jump out of the track. So as the rail goes down, the train wheel goes up in a section, and then the wheels derail and fall out of the track. That can happen, and this looks like a typical place where you get that kind of effect. But I think that's enough on track condition for now. The Aurora's got to go down that, by the way. I'm not looking forward to that. I'll report that as a rough ride to the control. Um, but anyway, let's have a look at trains. Full disclosure, I am not a train and locomotive expert. I've spent my adult life, my career, and my degree in infrastructure engineering, civils, mechanical and electrical, and telecoms. But I know a fair bit about trains and rolling stock as a necessity of my job. There's a lot of considerations you have to make for different types. So I can speak a little bit about trains, but I'm not someone that builds, maintains, or designs trains. I'm infrastructure, so I'll do what I can. There's some pretty interesting rail mounted vehicles in this game, not just trains. But it'd be rude not to start with the Aurora, the train that a lot of the missions are based around, that you and your crew travel around on. Now, it's my theory that the Aurora is based off one of these Soviet era steam trains that were built, which I found this really good article. Credit for the pictures and the article goes to them. It's from Abandoned Spaces by Anastasia Kolomiets, pictures by Pavel Rospopov. There's a steam train graveyard in the Ural region of Russia with these Soviet era steam engines. And the reason these were built, even when they had diesel and electric at the time, is because if, say, the apocalypse or World War III were to break out, in the event you lose your electricity grid or maybe fuel production as well, these trains will run on anything. There are plenty of trees in Russia, plenty of coal, and these will just continue to run, which is a strategic advantage of having steam. So my theory is, looking at these pictures, you can see that these look very similar to the Aurora, down to the front piston mounts, the walkways down the sides of the boiler. That's straight off the Aurora. The big red star on the front, that's straight off the Aurora. The style of the cab, I think it's one of these from this article, which I'll put a link to the article in the description. That's probably why the Aurora uses several different fuel types, as we see throughout the game. It's a strategic thing. And here the Aurora is, after all this time, performing the function that I think it was built for. This is a large train. I've seen sources online say it's 22.5 meters long, which looks approximately right. It's not quite as long as something like a Union Pacific Big Boy, some of the really big steamers from the American railways. They were that big to get them up steep inclines carrying a lot of freight. But nevertheless, a big train, and it's probably wider because of the gauge width. You can see it's got these walkways going around the boiler on the top that you can walk across. You can sort of chill out there while the journey's going on. And one of the major differences is the height of it. It's a very tall train, and the cab is sort of a big enclosed box with you can stand up on the steps and look out the windows. It's quite a tall cab, probably because a lot of the conversations in the game need to happen in there, and there's a lot of sort of cutscenes based in the cab that just wouldn't work in a normal train cab, which isn't that big on a steamer. But this is clearly a bit of a later design, and it's a bit of a technological mystery as well. This train, it's more technological than you might think. I think it's done for reliability. So it doesn't just run off coal. In the game, they throw coal in it, they throw wood in it, which it could. Anything that can boil water can make steam. But then also in one mission, you go and find diesel, because you can also fill this train with diesel and have it sprinkle it into the burner, into the system through perforated tubes. I think they said. So the train can basically run off several different fuels. See, it doesn't carry the usual tender or coal hopper behind it. A lot of trains behind the cab will have another section where they carry probably about a few couple of thousand gallons of water and a few tons of coal. This doesn't have that, so it's either short range or it's very efficient. You can see from the mixture of stuff in this cab, it's got a lot of elements of both sort of diesel electric and also steam. It's got valves and pipes and the stuff you'd expect to see in the cab of a steam train, although less of it. So it looks like a lot of the steam stuff that would normally be manually controlled is mechanically controlled in this case. And a lot of other switches and buttons that are more akin to something of a modern diesel or electric train. empty gauges. Given that this rail that it's running on, the Aurora may even, because it's from the day, may even have been able to run with overhead line traction. It's a possibility. I haven't seen because the roof's full of all that stuff, but it could well have done. Not much to do with engineering, but let's have a quick shufty at the inside of the carriage that you pick up. First of all, this absolute renegade, smoking right next to the no smoking sign. Total legend. Got every decent railway carriage needs a gunsmithing shop. Here's the missus. All right, love. The typical sort of net curtains. This is a nice little library section. Classic looking carriage interiors with the four beds up like that. Seen that a lot of times before on these sort of long transcontinental railways, the Barm Railway or the Trans-Siberian perhaps. And then here's the kitchen / galley where all the Russian special forces hang out and drink vodka and tell stories. Best place on the train. No, both the Aurora and the patrol train and all the other trains here are wide gauge, but you can see they're built to be this wide, and so is the network to accommodate them. You can see there's a lot of structure gauging going on. We're whizzing past signals, we're whizzing past overhead line masts, we're whizzing past signals there, more masts, and everything is, and then there's a tanker there. Everything is the correct amount of distance away for structure clearance, and now that's very important to maintain. You've got to manage the track position in order to maintain those tolerances, which is a job in itself. Getting the track back to where it's designed to be to maintain the structure clearance from things that you pass, signals. The last thing you need is to knock a signal over or hit an overhead line mast and bring it down. So that's clearly the track's not moved that much that it's impeding on the surrounding structures. So that's very good. Usually these days that's measured with a device that sits on the rails as if it was a train and shoots a distance measuring laser at objects around it, and that measures the distance away and creates a bit. You can create even a little bit of a 3D profile with that and check it's the right distance away for different types of trains. So you can artificially put a freight train or a passenger train there and check that the clearances are right for different types of trains. A couple of interesting bits down here showing some more of the rail of Metro. This is a rail-mounted tank. I don't know if anything like this actually existed. I know there was a tank in World War II that the Germans came up with that was hybrid. It had tracks, and I think rail wheels came out under the bottom of it, extended, much like today's road rail vehicles. I think that existed. I don't know about one that was solely rail-mounted, but there's no crossing nose there. The two rails are clipping. That's a bit of a derailment. But anyway, yeah, very interesting to have a rail-mounted tank. And then over here, we've got a rail-mounted machine gun emplacement. There's a machine gun emplacement bolted to a rail bogie there. Perhaps that's towed behind the tank to defend the rear of it. But in this case, it's been used as a machine gun emplacement. And here we are travelling down the line in the rail car, which is a small, we ran over a sandbag there, a small rail-mounted vehicle, only a couple of people on it, small engine. It's just a light little thing basically to patrol lines. And in the game, the guys make the decision not to bring the Aurora down here, which is very wise, because you can see the developers have intentionally made this look very unsafe. By removing sleepers, you can see the rail is broken often, frequently. There's a lot of breaks in the rail that this little car could manage, but the sleeper's missing, sleeper's broken. It's right on the cliff edge. There's a huge slope on the right hand side that obviously there's rock fall. Otherwise, how would all that have got over there? It's probably broken the rails. The masts have fallen down. This is really knackered railway. They've see rockfall sign there. They've done this very intentionally to make it obviously not suitable for the Aurora. So the team decides to send it the other way on a separate line, which was a wise decision because this one you just couldn't get something like the Aurora down here. And there we go. There's a rockfall, and we've derailed. You can see just beyond the junction there's a little shunt signal, ground signal, that is beyond the junction. In Britain, it's usual to have the shunt signal on the approach to the junction rather than beyond it. So maybe at the toe of the points there, rather than at the other side of it. But in Russian signaling, I think that's pretty normal. So we'll move over here and have a look at this ground signal. Banded to its concrete base, that's accurate, although it's been knocked. The bottom aspect being red and the top aspect being blue. Now this is confusing slightly because I thought in Russian signalling that shunt signals were white and blue, white being proceed and blue being prohibitive, like don't pass. But this signal, it's got blue at the top and red underneath it. So normally the most prohibitive aspect is the one closest to the driver's eye, for safety reasons. So on a tall signal, the red would be at the bottom, and on a signal that's ground mounted, the red would normally be at the top. The idea behind the blue and white signals instead of the normal red, yellow, green signaling is to differentiate it from that and to not confuse them with running signals on main tracks and distract the drivers. But the signal itself, mounted to a concrete base, that's very common. Concrete base piled in, and then you bolt and band it onto the base, and you can see the cable and the wiring coming off the back of it. That's good. This is a very sort of accurate signal. Nice hoods on it as well. Here we've got a main signal. This one you can see. This is a red closest to the driver's eye, bottom aspect, and the green at the top. That's good. This is a good representation of what a real sort of signal looks like. This is the junction box at the bottom there so you can replace the cable going to the top, and then the cable goes up through the middle of the post and into the disconnection box on the back of the signal. The wiring terminations will all be in there for the different aspects. You can see they've gone as far as to put a hinge and a spring-loaded little hinge on the bottom of that, where you could get into the back of it and replace the aspects which are either lamps or LED. And it's banded onto the post in a very realistic way. There's plenty of signals that look exactly like this around the network. This is a very believable design. They've obviously pulled this from something from the real world. There you go, the electrical junction box at the bottom. It's just useful to have a cable so you can replace either the one at the top or the one going across the line without having to replace the whole lot sometimes. And you do testing on it as well. So as we roll across this magnificent bridge, it has to be said, very well designed, very well rendered, lovely definition, setting. I have to say, I'm overall very impressed with this game. It's been made by people who clearly care and tried to get things right as they could. Obviously, it's a bit skewed with it being after the apocalypse and not everything's right and there's broken rails everywhere. But they've gone into a lot of attention to detail, like the areas where trains couldn't run and it was obviously too dangerous for the Aurora to go. They purposely made the track condition much worse. And they knew to do that and made all the sleepers broken and the rails broken and lack of ballast. And in the areas where it was well maintained, where the patrol trains are running, the infrastructure is quite good. And I like that disparity very much. It shows they've put a lot of thought into it. They've got an overhead line system, some of which we can see here. Excellent. It has all the right components. It's got a stretcher bar for the first time in a game. Not on all of them, but the points that move have a stretcher bar, and that's the important thing because in that they've realised it's needed for the mechanical operation of them. And a point machine and a points operating system like a lever or a hydraulic or a pneumatic or something to move those points across. Yeah, it's got areas of variable track condition. It considers Russian railway gauge, which is wider than most of the rest of the world, and this is clearly wide gauge. That's very good. They've got a proper rail design and an adequate system of joining that, which is the fish plate joints or the joint bars. That's very realistic. The switches and crossings are okay. They've included crossing noses and gaps to fit the wheels through the crossings. That's good. And they've gone through the effort of trying to plane the rails down in a lot of places to make them like the end of a proper switch rail. So they've paid a good bit of attention to detail there as well. All things considered, this is excellent. It doesn't have a working level crossing system like GTA 5, but you wouldn't do after the apocalypse. But it does have working points, which no other game so far has had, so it gets marks there. Obviously, it wouldn't have working signaling system because, again, apocalypse and electricity. but the infrastructure, the actual stuff is there, and if a very good effort from a game that is about railways, but you can tell they've really put effort in. This is excellent. So I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. Thanks for tuning in.